Welcome to the GrowthPulse podcast, where we take a deep dive into the world of business-to-business sales. We talk to some of the world's leading salespeople, sales leaders, experts in sales technology, and thought leaders in today's best sales skills and techniques. In this episode, we're talking to Chris Thomas. Chris is one of the world's leading experts in virtual reality, and in particular, its application to the work and training space. Chris started his career in sales, working for consumer brands such as Audi, Harvey Norman, and Telstra. He then joined the SaaS powerhouse Salesforce, where he held numerous roles across Australia, the UK, and New Zealand. This led him to a career in the VR space, where Chris has been at the forefront of reimagining how organizations use technologies such as VR, conversational UI, and natural language processing to take learning and enablement to the next level. From the GrowthPulse team, please welcome your hosts, Dan Bartels and Simon Peterson. Hey Simon, how are you, mate?
I'm very well, thanks, Dan. How are you?
I am good. Good. Happy Friday. Yeah, absolutely. It's been a busy week.
It has. Yeah, I'm really excited about today's conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
we get to look at VR, XR.
Yeah, I think what's happening in the sort of the AI space and VR, I think it's actually on the precipice of changing kind of how people go about learning and thinking about their roles. And I have no idea about this space at all. Yeah. It is so foreign to how I grew up and how I learned. But this is what, I look at my daughter who's just turned 11 in year 6 and how they're going to experience learning in the next kind of 20, 30 years is going to be completely different to what we've done.
Absolutely. I guess my fear of it is people will be closed in their virtual reality cocoons. I wonder how that's going to play out in terms of people relating to each other in the real world.
In the real world, maybe.
Anyway, we'll find out, won't we?
It'll be very different. So, anyway, well, let's bring Chris in and have that discussion. So, Chris, look, welcome to the podcast, mate. It's great to talk to you again. You and I worked together for a long time. It's good to be together in this format.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, mate, look, we start.
Welcome, Chris.
Yeah, welcome. We start off sort of most of these podcasts getting a bit of understanding of kind of your journey and how you got to where you are today, mate. And as per the intro, you've done a bunch of different things. What was your journey on sort of getting into sales and working through, and particularly like a stellar career at Salesforce? What are the things that you kind of sort of highlight out of that journey and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, for sure. I think, and like a lot of salespeople can relate to this as well, right? Like if you choose a career in sales, it's a bumpy road. Like you've got to learn the valuable lessons of the hard lessons, and I think I realized I had a knack for it, like at a relatively early stage as just working in Harvey Norman selling computers, which is a lot harder than you think. But then from there, sort of realizing potential and just understanding that the world has a lot more for me and people like me. I sort of naturally was just drawn to like more and more of the things I liked. And it's and I feel like you're always learning as well. Like I feel like I've learned just as much in the last couple of years as I have sort of in the last 20 years separately as well. So yeah, there's a lot to it.
Mate, you and I started in a very similar scenario. I started my sales career in mobile phone sales of all things. What do you think's the biggest difference between kind of that retail sales engagement and working in B2B sales? Because my personal opinion, I think there's lots of similarities. Yeah. What's your experience?
I think there's at the end of the day, you're just dealing with people. And it was, I feel like when I got into B2B sales, like the hurdle I had to overcome personally was especially working for a large organization. There's a lot of sort of systems and there's a lot of like the right ways to do it. But at the end of the day, you've just got to show up and be yourself, and people appreciate that. And that's what sort of generates the next conversation or whatever. And then you line that up with all like the the consistency and the high level of detail and sort of stuff that makes you professional. But at the end of the day, it's just been a good sort and showing up with a smile on your face and just being yourself.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. And I think earlier in your intro, Chris, you said your early days, you're selling computers in Harvey Norman harder than you would think. I completely agree with you. But you said something interesting there that I picked up on. You said as you started your sales career, people liked you. That's always lovely to hear. Why is that important for you in building a sales career?
People like me? Is that what you said I said?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I just cut out a little bit there. No, yeah, I think it just comes down to human nature at the end of the day, and people like it. People buy off people, and if people like sort of what you represent and just who you are as a person, that's really like the sort of that's the fundamentals of what will take the conversation to the next stage, right? Like if you don't have
for sure.
Yeah, but learns a lot in my career, especially
so building trust.
Building trust is a big thing. Yeah, building trust is a big thing. Yeah.
So what do you think is as you've kind of worked through, and again, I know in your career at Salesforce, Chris, you worked through a number of really different roles. You and I both started in Radian 6 way back in the day. Call out to our friends the Woods, who really own that organization locally. But you kind of started in the BDR space, and then you worked your way through in the partner space, and then obviously ended up as an account exec doing a bunch of different things. What do you think are the real differences between those key roles? Like if you think about the partner and even when you were looking at the agency space as well, like what do you think's the key differences in engaging one-on-one to a customer versus sort of one-to-many at the agency space? Like how did you approach it differently?
I got to say, from the time that I started Salesforce, so for a Kiwi out of the middle of nowhere, in the middle of New Zealand, to sort of come to Sydney and get a job with Salesforce in 2012 without realizing sort of what that company would become. It's just like the chances that happening are very slim. So I've got to say I'm very grateful for that experience, because it sort of opened my eyes, to the likes of working with you, Dan, where and a whole other bunch of friends and colleagues throughout that time period. Like it sort of comes back to realizing potential again, and when you're exposed to that level of innovation, like I didn't even know really what an acquisition was before I started Salesforce, and then like next thing you know, you've got Bailey, Exact Target, blah blah blah.
Yeah,
like it like just like opening your sort of mind and your world to that sort of experience in Sydney and London. I found it hugely tremendous. So just before I answer your question, like if I could give any advice to like young Kiwis, young Aussies, put yourself in a position where you are exposed to like just awesome experiences and in a way that you sort of see how the rest of the world works, because that was hugely valuable to me. But it was EBR back then. We used to call it EBR instead of EBR.
It wasn't EBR. You're right. It wasn't EBR. Yeah, that's right.
And that was because I don't know. I think I started just like maybe a few weeks before you, but on my first day I was packing it, mate. Like it was nerve wracking, right? And and then after a while, like I'm really thankful for the Woods and their guidance and the rest of that team, because that type of cohesiveness and support and sort of shared values are really sort of what propelled me into my professional career. And like EBR, like that was all about contacting people at scale. Like even today, like I don't want to brag, but when I send out a cold email, I am like I'm the man. Like I'm pretty good. and
Mate,
also
you got pretty good at it. I remember you went from not really having a good understanding of what to say to being the master. Absolutely.
Yeah, and then partnerships was like that was really cool as well, because you don't, although it's not like your traditional sales sort of carry the bag type role.
Yeah.
You do get a lot of exposure to founders. All your relationships are like people that run sort of multi-million-dollar companies, and you build sort of bonds and relationships with these people, and these people give you advice and sort of insight into the world that you know it is really hard to get. So like there was value in that. Partnerships in itself, like business planning, like the value of like understanding joint goals is valuable for anything. I even use it with my missus. Like having that sort of joint approach is really, really important. I hope that answered your question. I know that was a bit of a rant.
Look, it does. Look, it's. I think it's an important piece. I think, you know, Simon and I talk a lot about that planning side of things, whether it's at a, you know, between partnerships, between organizations. We're having to build a some sort of plan to run this podcast, right? And the sort of the businesses we're trying to launch out of this. And, but even down to, you know, I've talked for a long time around even inside a deal. You know, how do you build a plan on a deal? And I've got a sort of a phraseology I've used with teams for a long time now, which, you know, if you want everyone on the same page, there better damn well be a page. It's such a simple concept, right? But it's amazing how many people don't think about it. And, you know, I want to talk you through my plan. That's not a plan. That's just some ideas you've got. Like, build a plan with people that they can collaborate on with you. Something that's interesting. So look, we might pivot along, and I know you've moved your career into this space of VR, which is, you know, cutting edge technology. I mean, you know, there's, you know, Meta's probably leading the world in that charge at the moment, but there's, like all these types of technologies, and they're often a bit of a laggard in actually what's really happening in this space versus being the cutting edge. You know, where do you kind of see the VR space, and also how did you get into this?
Yeah, I think it's. I always knew after I was just a bit over 9 years at Salesforce, and I knew I needed to get my hands on some real sort of grassroots sort of business development stuff where you're not sort of supported by as many sort of processes and systems. Yeah. I just knew my fingertips were a little bit soft, so to speak. So I purposely decided to go into startup world, and I ended up working with this really innovative VR company, and that sort of just opened my eyes, and I like it's like a values thing. Like personally, like I'm a big advocate of learning. You know, I don't you know, getting a bit personal here, but the reason why I got into VR specifically is around learning. You know, like I left school quite early. I know for a lot of people, like learning is very difficult, and I saw this as a channel to sort of help people really, like, it comes back to that, like realizing your potential, right? Like through experience, because I can tell you all about like a certain topic, but like you don't really understand it until you've experienced it. It's like sales. Like I can tell you how to sell it, but unless you go out there and cut your teeth and sort of do the bumpy stuff, you're not going to figure it out until you actually do it. So that's sort of why it was about that. That's sort of why it was that's why I sort of followed that path. And then like at that point, I just you know, I knew like I wanted to start a business. It's just part of who I am. I'm just that type of person, and I just have to like do it at some point. And then luckily I met a couple of CEOs that were just once again just like became good mates, and they sort of been guiding me through the process and just helping me figure it out step by step, week by week. And it's it's been so now I'm doing what I enjoy.
Yeah, I mean, I think awesome. Learning in sales is really difficult. I was talking to a colleague only yesterday, that unlike most other careers that you can follow, there's no formal certification that you can go and do. There's no degree that will make you an enterprise salesperson or a top level VP. Like it is experiential. You can go and do someone's course on better tonality, maybe, or someone's course on how you deal with objection handling, but one they're not the same, and there's nothing that replaces the experience of it. And you mentioned before, you see people who have strong experiences in sales, like they either join a great team, they learn from some great people, they learn how to learn along that sales journey as well. I think that's a really critical piece as well. Simon, I mean, you've been in so many different teams with different leaders and different processes. What have been the key methods in which you've kind of learned over time, before we get into the technology that Chris is sort of taking us down? Like, what are the really important processes for salespeople learning that you've experienced?
I double down on Chris's comment about experience and experiencing how other people operate, how other people sell. I've said it before, some of the best leaders I've ever worked for and some of the worst leaders I've ever worked for have shaped who I am right now. And it's, back in my SAP days, watching other people grow and enterprise salespeople do their thing, you see what works and what doesn't work. And I think, I've got some horror stories that I probably won't share on this podcast of watching salespeople do the unthinkable. But I've also seen...
Maybe you should have an episode on that.
we probably should, yeah. Well, I'll put one of those down to make sure you've hung up on the phone from your prospect before you start rambling on about how terrible they are at buying your software.
That one too, yeah.
Yeah. It's some silly things like that. And, you actually learn. I think one of my biggest learnings out of that is you're never going to sell anything if you don't respect the person you're trying to sell to. So each little thing that you see along the way teaches you something. And, I'm intrigued. I think traditionally, I started work in the 90s and went through a whole process of, sitting in rooms, with 20 other people, listening to somebody prattle on about sales techniques. And there's the power. Well, when I started, it was an overhead projector, believe it or not. But then we got into, PowerPoint, and I just had to sit there and watch PowerPoints with 300 words on them for, 4 or 5 hours a day. You don't retain much, all right? And it's morphed a little bit. I think there's a lot more emphasis on mentoring and learning by doing these days, which I think, that's absolutely how I learn. I can't sit down for 4 hours, someone prattling on, telling me about the best way to sell. I need to, have the nuggets and the tidbits, but I got to go out there and do it. And when you start doing it, I think you probably felt this a bit too, Chris. You do feel like an imposter. You see everybody else around you that pretends how good a salesperson they are, and you kind of go home at night going, "Oh, can I really do that?" Look, Dan Bartels, he's got the gift of the gab. How am I going to sell that guy? Yeah. And, Chris, you send out amazing emails and messages when you're a BBR or BDR. You obviously didn't, come out of Christchurch knowing how to do that. You wanted into Salesforce and you saw other people doing it. And you said, I'm not going to repeat that one, but that's a really good idea. And then you build a whole bunch of tools in your own mental kit bag to actually get better at it. But the core of it, you've got to trust and respect the person you're selling to. And as you said, Chris, it's a person. So there's a lot of psychology involved. So I guess as you understand, sales is a lot about psychology and getting into the empathy for the person you're selling to. You can't just do that sitting in front of a PowerPoint. And I guess it's an interesting segue for you, Chris, because you're obviously taking that experience learning to the next level, right? It's if I physically can't be out selling every day of the week, how do I emulate that process? How do I teach the brain what works and what doesn't work? And obviously, clever use of technology is taking us a step forwards.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've got to just say, because any of my mates listening to this will will comment on it from. I only lived in Christchurch for a short period of time. I'm a what you call a Jaffa, or a blues fan, and a proud one at that. So I just need
okay.
to
Right. You realign that, mate.
Okay.
Yeah. We don't want you having to buy a round of beer at the bar, mate, just because we said you were from Christchurch, my friend.
I'm trying to run a business. I can't afford to buy my mates.
No, exactly. That's like saying, "Hey, Dan, you're from Adelaide, aren't you, mate?"
Oh, it's even worse, mate. It's like saying I support the Maroons, mate, during State of Origin. Nah, all good.
I just got a sense that all our Queensland viewers just turned off.
Oh, that's all right. Hey, look, they're enjoying their success rates at the moment. It's been a long time since I've enjoyed watching the State of Origin. Anyway, and look, underneath all that, I'm a West Tigers fan. So, mate, what are we, second from the bottom of the ladder? So, anyway. So, look, Chris, pivoting into kind of what you're doing from a technology perspective, right? So, learning is hard, and I know when we work together, we spent so much time as a team talking to each other and trying to recreate the scenarios or the stories around what went well, what didn't go so well, or how do I rethink about, an objection or a conversation or a meeting that I had. And there was always an aspect of that missing. We've all sat in long enablement sessions where somebody's trying to translate into 42 PowerPoint slides, and by slide 4, you've turned off.
Yeah.
Or you look up and someone's on their mobile phone already, scrolling through TikTok, or back in the day it was through Facebook or whatever, right? But so how is the VR space kind of reimagining that, and sort of what are you guys addressing in that kind of experience?
Yeah, cool. So I think if the way we see it is that the VR is a new medium. Like it's like think of it back in the days when we were selling Radian 6, right? Social analytics. There are a lot of people that got it. There are more people that didn't realize what a necessity it would become or how big social would get. And there are a lot of people that didn't believe it, or just I can't perceive it, so it's all sort of dust in the wind.
It's just a noise for them, yeah.
Yeah, which is fair, because there's a lot of noise. So I'm not dismissing anyone's sort of opinions, but we could see that there was something significant growing there, right? And it's definitely the same way I feel about VR. And a customer gave me an analogy the other day. I liked it so much, I put it on the website. And it's if you think of VR, and when I say VR, I should really say immersive learning, AR, VR, XR. It's all sort of going to amalgamate into the same thing. If you think about immersive learning, I'm just going to call it VR because it's easier. Two words. If you think about VR as it is today, it's similar to motion picture was in the 1800s. Back then, everyone's mates, you sort of go with your friends, your missus, whatever, to the picture theaters to see a film that someone had shot of a train leaving the station. There was nothing to it apart from a big old locomotive sort of leaving the station, and it was the novelty of the picture moving that blew people's minds. And it wasn't for years after until the producers of this type of content started to develop plot structure, like narrative, character development, and all the stuff we sort of see today when we're when we're watching TV on Netflix or whatever, right? Like, it's come a long way, and the way that we feel that VR is perceived today is very much through the lens of e-learning. E-learning is awesome, and there's some awesome content out there, but we haven't really harnessed the way this medium. We haven't really harnessed this medium for its full potential, and it'll be a long time before we really do. So we're all about helping our customers identify meaningful ways of like utilizing this medium and with all the cool stuff you can do. So
yeah. I mean, just talking
so
about
how does
value. Sorry, go on, Tom.
Yeah, I was going to say, how does look? I get the idea of continual learning, and obviously content is very specific to the organisations you're talking to. But I'm thinking to myself, people listening to this, you put on a pair of goggles. How does that actually inherently improve the learning experience, other than the novelty of putting on some goggles? Because I think you're talking to businesses all the time, right? And we all love gadgets. So I've got a Meta goggle set that I've had for a couple of years, and I enjoy that. But I can't, in my own mind, I'm still at watching the train leave the station. I remember my first experience was sitting on a roller coaster with these goggles on. That was my train leaving the station moment with VR. But you're talking to organisations that typically they need to make a profit, and they need to enable their teams. If they do it poorly, they go out of business. So how do you take the novelty of a goggle, mix it with education, and provide value? What's different about it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it's a lot of the reasons why VR is valuable for learning isn't exactly the same as why people buy. And I think this is the same for a lot of things. But
that's interesting.
It's like it's like VR is like, I mean, there's a bunch of studies out here, and it's still very debatable. Like, I know PwC did a study back in 2020 that said people are 3.75% more times more emotionally connected to the content. They learn 4 times faster, than classroom-based stuff. They're more focused, which I get. It's really hard to quantify, and it's sort of come up for a debate a few times whether like is this actually valuable? I say to anyone sort of questioning that, go put on a headset and use an application with like well-developed content that actually, not just with the novelty of VR, but with well-developed content with a storyline and a narrative, and like judge on that. As for like how organizations purchase this sort of stuff, like the hardware itself today, like it's not really affordable at scale for an organization to adopt. Mm-hmm. So like a company like DealPlay isn't going to go into an organization and sell 100 headsets with like this application development to solve a certain problem or to address a specific learning need. The reason why they're buying it today is more, if you put it down to value drivers, it's more competitive advantage, like to be seen as doing something different, and reputation. That's why people buy it. Mm-hmm. When it gets to a stage where the masses start to adopt it, and you've got to take into consideration that anyone who is in school these days are going to be exposed to VR. Like the education sector is one of the largest adopters of VR. Like if you're going to school these days, you'll have a headset on at some point. The number of VR headsets that are deployed into the market in 2025 will outnumber the amount of Xbox consoles deployed into the market.
Wow.
And then you've just seen Apple release Apple Vision Pro, and despite there's always going to be controversy about whether an Apple product will be successful or not, but the truth of the matter is Apple, they very rarely sort of mess it up. So whether it's this iteration or
they've got the distribution at least, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
it's for mass market.
The undercurrent is coming, right? Like it's going to happen. It's just sort of understanding it and being prepared for it. And if you're going to engage in what we call PR VR, which is essentially just creating something for innovation to take to expos or to show your clients, or even to sort of assess for future investment. Just understand that it's very, very feasible to do these days, and you can do some cool stuff.
Yeah, because I think, Chris,
so if we think about
logic, sorry, Simon, one sec. The logic behind immersive technology makes a lot of sense. We've all experienced, all those of us who have got kids, experienced kind of lockdown education over the last couple of years, where your kids weren't immersed in education, and they had so many distractions around them, and the logic of them being back in a classroom. Like my wife's a kindergarten teacher, so those kids get immersed in learning for 6 hours a day when you take out lunch and other bits and pieces, right? And their classrooms are created in this immersive experience of how do you learn to read, and how do you learn to write, and how do you learn, basic numbers and all these types of things. And so they spend so much time creating this environment that is an immersed learning experience. Yet for us as adults, when you're learning, it's in between two meetings that you're super stressed about, in a blank room that you don't want to be in, that's cold or too hot or too noisy, or your chair squeaks, or like all these things just take away from your learning experience. And then we wonder why, because I've got my laptop up and I'm actually doing work while I'm trying to learn on the PowerPoint deck that you didn't build well because you're not a teacher and you haven't put a structure behind it. We're surprised at the end of all of that, people took in like 1% of what you were trying to educate them on. So, I mean, like Simon, you had a question there, but what are your thoughts on that?
It's an interesting one. What I'm doing is I'm actually trying to think of where it's going, Chris's vision, and I'm imagining myself as a brand new BDR. My job is to contact prospects and get meetings for my sales guys, and I'm about to start my first job in 2026. So I'm giving us a couple of years, and the first thing I do when I join a new big company, we've all been there. Your first day, there's a laptop. Back in the early 2000s, you turn up for your first day. There was a laptop, there was an iPad, a phone, and probably a water bottle branded. I'm imagining I turn up on my first day in 2026, and I've got my laptop, and they don't give me an iPad anymore, but there's a Vision Pro set of goggles sitting in a nice box next to my laptop, and that's how I'm going to learn. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, so how am I going to learn? So I put these goggles on, and I imagine as a new BDR, I'm now immersed in a sales planning meeting where I'm looking at all the managers around me, chatting about what I need to do and how I need to do it. I'm imagining, hopefully it's two-way by that stage. I'm imagining also that the cold calls that I typically have to role play in a boring room that's too cold, as Dan mentioned, are out the window, right? I'm suddenly immersed in a real live cold call role play. So I'm actually talking, potentially the AI is talking back to me, and I'm getting really good at having conversations with people I've never met before. And because the AI is recording my conversation, it's also understanding what I get right, what I don't get right. And at the end of it, I can see a scoreboard that says, you nailed these parts of our value proposition, you started a bit here, you need to focus a little bit on that. So, and I think to that point of view, that's not passive learning. And from my perspective, when you're having a two-way conversation, whether it be a real person or an AI, as you're learning, it's going to stick in here. You're going to come up to speed way faster. So that's kind of my vision for the ultimate sales enablement type of process. And I mentioned, the other thing is, when I remember my first day as a sales leader, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I obviously pretended to the managers that had promoted me into that role that I knew exactly what I was doing, but I didn't have a clue. I remember my first forecast meeting where I had 20 people in a room and I was leading a forecast meeting for the first time. It was, I didn't want to show it, but it was scary. And I emulated previous managers in terms of asking the same questions. But I imagine if I'd had the ability to role play that whole exercise, I would have got much better, much faster. I don't know, Chris, you're nodding along there. Am I on the right track here? Is this where it's going?
No, yeah, it's so interesting. Like a lot of what we do, and you've got to show like a sort of tough, calm face and continue on and maintain your composure, and it's so important. But like it's like everyone does it. Everyone like jumps directly into the fire, and that's the best way to learn. I still am a big advocate of that.
Yep.
You like I remember back in Radiant 6 days doing like some role playing with Dan Bartels, and if you're ever in a role play situation with the silverback, you better come prepared, because you know like he's not going to mess around. But those types of engagements are just so valuable. The ones that like get you out of your seat and like you know, like your experience running a forecasting call, like my experience first day at Salesforce, like that level of uncomfort like puts you in a position where you're alert and your receptors are open and you're learning, your neural pathways are going all like this, and you absorb a lot more.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting experience of as you move through your career in these types of roles, you move from being in inside sales to outside sales. You move from sales into leadership. From first line to second line. There's always these points of the first time where you operate without a net, and there's no one there to hold your hand or make sure you get this bit right. And all of a sudden, it's your meeting versus you watching somebody else in the meeting. Or all of a sudden, it's your forecast call. And if you don't ask the right questions of your team, you're now accountable to the forecast call that you give upstream. And do you not know the answers to these questions? Are you not across these deals? And your honest answer is, of course I'm not. They're not my deal. Right? But you're the leader, and or you're the AE on this deal. And the customer has just said, hey, but listen, I spoke to Chris, my BDR, on this deal and on this engagement. I gave them a whole bunch of discovery. Do you not have that? And I know for us working for a CRM company back in the day, it was one of the worst faux pas you could make was, hold on, don't you guys have a CRM? Didn't you write this in the notes? And as you're looking at the CRM screen, and there's no notes. But that stuff happens. And so you learn from experience then to be able to ask the people around you to say, hey, listen, when you spend the extra 30 seconds writing those notes, they become critical for these reasons. Then you go to the next level of what I want in those notes are these things, because the conversation I need to have with somebody more often than not ends up looking like this. And then as we build knowledge around one person lost, one person won because they had this information. Therefore, let's make sure that's in all of our engagements. These are the types of questions, or how's the best way to phrase those questions? Here are 1,770 examples of the same question phrased in a different way. 5 of them work, and the other 165 are examples of how to get to the 5 that work. And like all those things about how do you stand on the shoulders of giants, right? And those around you to be more successful. And I think that's the really interesting thing for me in this technology that you're sort of spending time in. And even when you then think about everybody's dabbling, I wouldn't say they're relying yet on things like conversational AI. So that's ChatGPT and other bits and pieces, right? And it doesn't have this stuff nailed at all. It's a long way from it. Yet I can quickly see a lot of people becoming carbon copies of each other because they're relying on ChatGPT to write their introduction email. Well, if I'm getting 12 introduction emails an hour that all look like they were written by the same person because they were written by ChatGPT, you're not standing out. I'm not watching it. It's only going to be moments until the AI that's receiving and reading the email goes, that's AI. I'm not interested. Right? I mean, it's like
junk mailbox, yeah.
Yeah, it's going to go straight into the junk mailbox, right? I mean, there's meant to be AI now that takes what AI wrote and makes it not sound like AI, but it's AI. So ours is like, it's still AI, right? There's no flavor. There's no, there's no one knowing how to drop a joke in about, Queensland and New South Wales state of origin in the right context, because they've read the fact that that person went to this particular school and that's a rugby league school, therefore they're likely going to care. Or you bothered to look at their long-term LinkedIn post and you saw that last year they went to the state of origin. Hey, they're likely going to care. This is a good joke, given we're midway through a series, right? So like all those things come out, and that's AI is never going to get to that level of humanity. It can't, because it doesn't have our experiences.
Dan, I'd never say never, Dan.
Well,
I disagree. Hey, ChatGPT, look up this guy's LinkedIn profile. Tell me what he's been doing over the last year, and include a joke about something or other he went and did that was sport related. Bingo.
Yeah, but I can't see it having the experiential part of it. I can't see it knowing how to drop in. Well, but if it does, if that's where we get to, then we're all doing different things, because AI is just going to talk to AI, right? I mean, that's kind of where it's at. But I don't see it getting to that level, at least not in probably our working lifetimes. I mean, Chris, you're the expert here, mate. You tell me, where do you think this is going?
I think it's like I think it's gonna reshape our lives in ways like we just can't comprehend right now, right? Like we don't know, but like I think it will it's gonna shift it's gonna change the playing field a little bit in terms of like email outreach. Yeah, definitely. But if I receive an email from someone, like I can tell right away if it's a mass email or if it's personalized to me, and I can tell right away if this person is like a genuine person. Are you contacting me because you want to talk to me, or do you want to find someone in my profile? And the thing that AI I think won't be able to cover is the fact that I understand that this person has something in common with me, and that's why comes back to just being like a normal regular human. It's like I know this person has something. I have something in common with this person, and that's the human connection piece, right?
Yep. So, Chris, pivoting back to the education, learning through the goggles, etc. Obviously, we just talk. Human interaction is fundamental. If I'm training everybody in a bubble with goggles on, am I enabling them in how to talk person to person?
I think sorry, I got the sniffles. Sorry if that shows up on the podcast. We've got so it's a really important question, and I don't have that. Like I think like immersive experiences does have the potential to sort of push us away more, but I also think that humans tend to think worst case scenario, and if you look at it, I think if you look at what sort of immersive environments are we involved in today? Like I know on my phone, I can easily get stuck in sort of LinkedIn, just sort of doom scrolling for 30 minutes and not realize it, right? Like it's happened to everyone. This is immersive behavior right here. Like the way I see it is that with VR and also with mobile, like we can adjust how this immersive engagement operates. So I'm learning something and I'm bettering myself, and I start to sort of care more about spending time with the right people in my life, as opposed to just like the sole objective of getting impressions for some sort of social media company. So I see it as something to explore. We definitely need to understand it more, because we're already immersed. We're already part of the matrix. You know what I mean? Like I think we just need to be more conscious of it and more intentional about how we how we look at content and how we interact with content and how content is designed and delivered.
Yeah, I think that content delivery piece and design is a really interesting question. I think you mentioned this a bit earlier, and we were talking about this just pre-pressing the record button, right? So, a mate of mine has got a cool podcast. We're talking about cool podcasts before we joined on. It's actually about the he was one of the lead investigators from the Australian Navy on the MH370 disappearance, and back in the day, he would have had to go out and convince a television production company to do a big recording and run that whole process of it being a TV show. Instead, he spun up a podcast. It's 8 episodes. You got an event involved. It's cool. Have a listen. It's pretty cool. But like even now, us having this show today, the technology has lowered the barrier of entry, and it's meant that people can have a really different way of delivering content. So I can easily immerse my team in VR without having to spend millions of dollars on technology to make it work. I can use technology that everybody is democratizing across a whole bunch of different spaces to try and work out how I make this work. I mean, content creators now make significant amounts of money, depending upon whether you keep your clothes on or off. It's a reality of what the market is. That's always been there. It's not going to disappear anytime soon. I'm not talking out of school and being rude here, but that's just the reality of it. But even those who are just creating business content make a fortune in terms of creating good content, and it's not now beholden to mass networks to own. I mean, there's still space for the mass networks. I mean, we're just mentioning you were talking about Marvel and things before. I mean, Marvel as a comic book company got sold for $4 billion to Disney, but you've got content creators who are worth hundreds of millions of dollars operating out of their bedroom. I mean, it's this flattening of how we create and sort of take in this content, right? So, yeah, interesting.
I think a lot of it is it's sort of like it's creating it's like a marketplace, and it's like adding competition to create innovation, right? And if you look at like some of the content creators today, like what I like about some of the stuff is like some of these topics like mental health or like fitness, like these guys and girls are creating content that's like really thoughtful, because that's what you need to do to establish a channel. Like there's some easy routes, but like there is a subsection of the marketplace that are just creating really thoughtful, innovative, and really cool stuff, which makes sort of doom scrolling not too bad. But
So, Chris, we're getting kind of to the top of the hour, mate. And one of the things we kind of like to wrap up the podcast with is, kind of a look back at the lessons that we've seen, great salespeople have in their careers, and things they wouldn't do again, or things they would definitely ensure that they do more of. As you kind of look back through your experiences, your career, like what are the couple of things that you'd suppose do more of, and a couple of things you do less of?
I think I definitely would have started a business earlier, and like if there's it's a tough thing to do, but definitely more of jumping directly into the fire. Like people sort of discount their own value and their own competency, but if you put yourself in a tough situation, like a really tough situation, like the likelihood is you'll figure it out somehow, and it'll make you a better person. So jump into the fire is a big one. And then as well as I think like one thing for me is just those sort of personal connections. So if I'm feeling tired, or if I'm struggling, like spending time with my kids, or spending time with my partner, or spending time with like my brothers or family or whatever, or just having like conversations sort of is what brings me to life. And I'll definitely do more of that.
Yeah, fair. What's something you do less of?
Probably I wouldn't eat as much KFC. I don't know. Actually, I take that one back. No, I'd probably spend. I'd probably spend less time. I'd probably spend less time just. I don't know. I'm struggling. I'd probably spend less time trying to do stuff for other people, or just trying to impress other people. I think that's probably
That's self-confidence, right?
Yeah,
for sure. Well, Chris, mate, that's been it's been amazing to talk to you. You know, you guys are doing some phenomenal stuff in the VR space and technology space. You know, learning continues to be it's a huge part of what we're doing here. I mean, you know, Simon and I had a bit of a fire to share sort of our lessons and the lessons of all those around us, to make sure that you know, we can impart a bit of sort of our experience and knowledge. You know, I know back to when we worked together at Salesforce and Radiant 6, a huge part of what we do and spend time doing as a team would be as individuals or as a group, just talking through deals and, you know, drawing stuff on a whiteboard. And people have given me stick for being the dude on a whiteboard for years, right? But it's been so valuable, and I've always gravitated to finding people in a team that you can just have those constant conversations with and be self-analytical and share your knowledge. And it's amazing to see that you're doing some great stuff in that space as well, and really continuing on that journey. So, mate, thank you so much for joining us. You know, for all of our listeners, etc. Look, please, wherever you have found this podcast, whether it's YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, any of the podcast locations, please do like, follow, share, all those different fancy things you need to do to make sure you help push our content out there. If you have any questions, please do chuck them in the comments. We will do our best to get back to you. And if you have an idea for a great podcast, you'd love to be on the podcast and tell your story, please do reach out. You know, we'd love to have you on. So thank you, Chris, so much. Simon, thank you for your time as always. And
absolutely. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, have a great day.
Thanks, guys. Really enjoyed this. It's awesome what you guys are doing as well. I'll catch you later.
Thanks, Chris.
See you later.